This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast. I'm historian Stephen Ujifusa. At Tradewinds History, one of the things I really enjoy working on is family history. This is an interest that began with my own family when I was very young, and I enjoyed asking members of both sides of my family questions about their own lives. One person I was particularly drawn to was my maternal step-grandfather, Joseph Follmann, Jr. My grandmother, Judy, married him in 1955. My biological grandfather died very young, a few years before. And Grandpa Joe was a fascinating and brilliant individual. He was a native of Philadelphia. He was born in 1908, and he attended West Philadelphia High School and then attended the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, where he paid for his tuition, paying in dance bands during the summer. And he was an excellent pianist. He also played the trombone. At heart, he was always a musician and an artist. But to make a living, he ended up becoming an insurance executive. But music and American musical theater was always his first love. I ended up moving to Philadelphia for graduate school, attending the University of Pennsylvania myself between 2003 and 2005. And I began researching his own life a little bit, just for fun. And the thing that he really enjoyed most as an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania was the Mask and Wig Club, a musical performing troupe that was founded in the late 19th century and still continues on to this day. And I began researching his own contributions to this storied student club and organization. He was music director, he played the piano, and as a graduate of the club in the 1940s and 1950s, he wrote the scores to some of the student musicals. And I think this was a very important outlet for him. Even when he was working in the business world, he maintained contact with a lot of his artist friends who he knew working at the Hedgerow Theater just outside of Philadelphia in the 1930s. Before he went into the business world, he was a full-time jazz musician, he was a Marxist, he was an intellectual, and then by the 1940s, he had gotten a bite of reality and decided to turn away from that world, but he always felt a longing for that. And my uncle, Jeffrey Brooks, who was his stepson, wrote about his relationship with Joseph Follmann in the introduction to his book on Russian history and culture. This book is entitled The Firebird and the Fox, Russian Culture Under the Tsars and the Bolsheviks, that was published a few years ago. And my uncle Jeff writes about how his stepfather introduced him to Russian authors, Russian music, and encouraged his interest in that field. And ultimately that led to my uncle becoming a professor. And he recently retired from Johns Hopkins University. My uncle wrote that, quote, "Our dinner table hosted, among many others, various down-and-out actors, painters, writers, and musicians who knew that, thanks to Joe's continued enthusiasm for the arts and his day job that could put ample food on the table, they would find a welcome." My uncle continued, "In the years that followed, I never lost the rare and valuable insight Joe helped me to attain. That culture is the creation of real people, reacting to the constraints and serendipities of their personal and social circumstances, and ultimately connecting humanity's past to our present and future." But I would like to read a little bit from my own findings about what made my grandfather tick and what made him continue his interest in the arts even after he had left that world. And it all goes back to the storied Mask and Wig Club at the University of Pennsylvania. And I would like to read an excerpt from a few articles called Echoes from the Mask and Wig Club. And this was written in 2014. Many years ago, when I was helping my grandmother decide which records to donate to the New York Public Library from her extensive collection, I found a set of fragile shellac discs protected by brown paper sleeves. They were old dance records from the 1920s that had belonged to my grandfather, Joseph Follmann, Jr., who had passed away in 1989. They were 78s and thus could fit only one song on a side. The songs included Say That You Love Me by Fred Waring's Pennsylvanians and Old Man River by Paul Whiteman and his orchestra. All were recorded at the Victor Studios in Camden, New Jersey. Among them were 2 discs of songs from old Mask and Wig productions. My grandmother had a 78 setting on her record player, or as she called it, a Victrola. We put on a record of Gems from Hoot Mon from the 39th annual production of the Mask and Wig Club, which included the foxtrot We'll Paddle Our Canoe, recorded by Nat Shilkret and the Victor Orchestra and the Mask and Wig Glee Chorus. Then there was I Live the Life I Love from a record labeled 50/50, the name of the 1937 show. According to alumnus Don Fisher, my grandfather was credited as the conductor and rehearsal pianist. He loved the club so much that he came back 7 years after graduation to assist with the show. The sound was scratchy and thin, the voices high-pitched and nasal. We saved the records. I was only 10 when Grandpa died, yet I knew that he loved the Mask and Wig Club, that legendary theatrical troupe started by a group of University of Pennsylvania students in 1889, and whose song and dance antics have been delighting Philadelphia and American audiences ever since. Among the group's notable alumni was Bobby Troup, who composed the jazz standard Route 66. Among the pictures in my parents' home was a photograph of Grandpa Joe seated with the West Philadelphia High School Orchestra. He was a pianist, so unlike the other members who are proudly holding their flutes, violins, and trumpets, he is sitting, hands folded, next to the portly mustachioed conductor. There is also a framed certificate of his election to the club dated May 1st, 1929. And his club rosette sits in an old pen shot glass. Made in France, the rosette's brass clasp reads. Grandpa served as music director of the club his senior year, composing many of the songs in the pit band. In those days, the club toured around the country in a special Pullman train, graciously provided by the Pennsylvania Railroad. He graduated from the Wharton School in 1930 with the hopes of becoming a professional musician. According to family lore, he even played piano at the Folies Bergère in Paris and recorded with dance bands such as Fred Waring and his Pennsylvanians, whose most famous song was Collegiate, a hot jazz riff on the carelessness of roaring 20s college life. Trousers baggy, all our clothes are raggy, but we're rough and ready, yay, rah-rah, very, very seldom in a hurry, real collegiate are we. Yet the life of a professional musician is always tough, and during the Depression it was nearly impossible to be seldom in a hurry to make ends meet. He went into the insurance business and married a stage actress, dividing his time between New York and Philadelphia. He became close friends with a number of people in the Philadelphia art scene throughout his involvement with the Hedgerow Theater in Rose Valley, befriending actors such as Richard Basehart, who played Ishmael in the classic movie Moby Dick, starring Gregory Peck as Captain Ahab, and Eleanor Sidney Wilson, an actress and artistic polymath from the Wetherill Paint family, who created abstract canvases well into her 90s. Grandpa Joe lost his first wife to cancer in the 1950s and took a cruise on the Holland America liner Maasdam. It was on board this ship that he met my grandmother, tragically widowed at a young age with 2 children, my uncle and my mother. The 2 were married shortly afterwards, and Grandpa Joe moved permanently to New Rochelle, New York. Grandpa retired from his job as an insurance executive in the 1960s, taught as an adjunct at NYU's Stern School of Business, wrote a few business books, and continued to play the piano, both jazz and classical. My brother Andrew and I spent a lot of time as young children in our grandparents' Upper East Side apartment. The piano was at the center of the living room, a 1926 Steinway that Grandma and Grandpa had purchased together. A 2-foot-high statue of Beethoven, painted to look like bronze, sat on the piano case, along with 2 brass candlesticks. Grandpa loved playing Peter's theme from Sergei Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf for my brother and me, and we could not get enough of it. Sometimes he would put my hands over his as he ran his fingers over the keys. I never learned how to play. I tried the oboe instead. That's one difficult instrument, Grandpa scoffed. He was right. After I had braces put on, I got lazy, stopped practicing, and that was the end of that. In his early 80s, Grandpa Joe began suffering from memory problems. One day he sat down at the Steinway and started to play a piece he had composed many years ago, according to my grandmother, a short filler piece for the Philadelphia Orchestra. Yet he could not remember it. My grandmother said he closed the piano, walked away, and never opened it again. He died soon afterwards from a heart attack. The Mask and Wig records are now at my parents' house, locked away in a case along with other records from Grandpa Joe's extensive classical library that did not get donated to the New York Public Library. Yet there is no turntable to play them now, either at 33 or 78 RPM. Beethoven is there too, standing with his arms folded amidst a forest of houseplants. He did, after all, like taking afternoon walks in the Vienna woods. As I grew older, I wanted to know more about my step-grandfather, Joseph Follmann Jr. And according to what I did learn, his parents were working-class German Americans from West Philadelphia. According to my mother, his stepdaughter, his mother was a Bavarian Catholic, and his father a Prussian Protestant who may have worked as a coal miner in his youth. There's a photograph of my parents' house showing him around the age of 10, with long blonde hair and dressed in a sailor suit. He is standing at the knee of a grizzled-looking old man reading a book, most likely his own grandfather. Grandpa Joe's obsession with economy, served up with stereotypical Teutonic severity, continued into his adulthood, even after he had achieved financial stability. Leaving the lights on in an empty room was a pet peeve. Many of his fellow students at the Wharton School were being groomed for leadership in tightly held businesses. In those days, there were many such family concerns in Philadelphia, from manufacturers, Diston and Baldwin, to magazines, Curtis, to banks, Philadelphia Savings Fund Society, to railroads, the Pennsylvania. In those heady years, just before the stock market crash, Grandpa had no desk at a family business waiting for him after graduation. Studying finance was a practical route. What he really wanted to be was a professional musician. Perhaps Grandpa was dreaming of following in the footsteps of Ted Weems, who had also graduated from West Philadelphia High and penned 7 years ahead of him, and had cut a big figure in the American collegiate hot jazz scene during the booming Roaring Twenties. The Mask and Wig, which was so prosperous it had donated money to build a quadrangle dormitory, was a particular preserve of the old Philadelphia elite, who had the time and the funds to indulge in such musical skylarking. Their show program books were chock full of advertisements from prominent and now largely vanished Philadelphia businesses. The clubhouse, a converted church, a long trolley ride from campus, had been lavishly renovated by Philadelphia architect Wilson Eyre Jr. in the 1890s, and its first-floor bar adorned with murals by celebrated artist Maxfield Parrish. In those days, one did not formally join the Mask and Wig Club until senior year. After a year or two of working as a choral alternate, little more than a grunt. According to the show programs, Grandpa was listed as a choral alternate his sophomore and junior years, and he was not formally elected to full membership until his senior year. Grandpa's eagerness comes across in the photograph of the Mask and Wig Undergraduate Club in the 1930 University of Pennsylvania record. Amidst his stone-faced, bolt-upright compatriots, a fresh-faced Grandpa Joe looks alert as he leans jauntily to one side, his eyes sparkling. His ears stick out from his head, just the way I remember them when he was older. He had made it. His hard work at the piano at his composer's desk had paid off, and he was proud. He had been the music director and co-writer of that year's show John Faust, Ph.D., a comic spoof on the German legend popularized by Christopher Marlowe and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. This was a time when songs from the Mask and Wig and other collegiate groups became national hits, covered by the likes of Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, and Frank Sinatra. Perhaps Grandpa hoped that one of his songs would hit the big time. Grandpa continued to contribute to the club well after graduation. In fact, he contributed songs to Mask and Wig shows for the next 2 decades, most notably in the 1937 production 50-50, and culminating in the show Doctor, Dear Doctor of 1951. By then, the club's roster of undergraduate members had diversified considerably from the blue-blooded old days. Grandpa conceived the book and produced the show, basing it on Jean-Baptiste Molière's 1666 play Le Médecin malgré lui, a physician in spite of himself. A photograph from the show's program shows Grandpa Joe, looking a bit more as I knew him, balding with more pronounced jowls, smiling with delight as he pores over a set of scenery mock-ups with a colleague. Doctor, Dear Doctor premiered at Philadelphia's Schubert Theater in November of 1951. Grandpa and his fellow scriptwriters apparently left Molière's original plotline alone, as the gags about the dim-witted, dissolute woodchopper Scagnarelle turned doctor proved just as funny then as they were during the Grand Siècle. The show received a glowing review from Henry T. Murdoch in the Philadelphia Inquirer on November 21st. This reviewer wasn't around in 1889 when Lorline launched the Wiggers' history, he wrote, nor for a few years after that. But taking the standard of the last 25 years, few shows have been so attractively staged, so colorfully staged, or so swiftly danced as the current enterprise at the Schubert. Glancing through the program book, I found a big surprise. Among those in the show's cast are a senior named Sidney Thayer Fisher and a sophomore named Barry E. Nur, both of whom I would one day sing with in the Orpheus Club of Philadelphia. That was the last year Grandpa contributed songs and his time as a rehearsal pianist to the Mask and Wig Club. Perhaps by then he had realized that, despite his prodigious musical talent, making it big in show business was not in the cards for him. By then his career as an insurance executive was taking up more and more of his time. Despite the fine reviews, Doctor, Dear Doctor was his last hurrah, and he knew it. Within a few years, he had moved to New York, was widowed, married his second wife, my grandmother, and adopted her two small children, my uncle and mother. He enthusiastically supported my mother's studies as a classical violinist. The two of them spent many hours playing piano and violin sonatas in their Manhattan living room. Yet my guess is that despite the local success of Doctor, Dear Doctor, Grandpa then realized that American musical theater was destined to be his pastime rather than his livelihood. He continued to attend shows and remain active in the Graduate Club. My New York-born grandmother said that back then there was nowhere to eat in Philadelphia except bookbinders, of course, but it seems that he cut back on his own musical contributions. Grandpa Joe died in 1989, aged 81. I was 10 at the time. I still miss him. I have lived in Philadelphia for 2 decades of my adult life, and for part of that time, not far from the old West Philadelphia High School and the University of Pennsylvania. My children still look at the Beethoven statue, which now sits in our library in Mount Airy. I've been to Mask and Wig shows and have seen his caricature in the Rathskeller of the clubhouse on Quinn Street. Sadly, his Steinway is no longer in our family. It's not just Peter and the Wolf that I associate with Grandpa, but a wistful Mask and Wig tune from the 1937 show 50/50 that for so long sat unplayed in my family's record collection. I live the life I love. This is historian Stephen Ujifusa, and this is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast.